Curaçao is currently going through a bit of a process and an update in their regulations. It's no secret that in the industry, Curaçao was seen as an easy way to get into the market because the regulatory obligations were not as onerous as the European counterparts.
Welcome to another episode of CEOpen Mic. Today we're hosting Owen Baldacchino, and the type of the person you are is that you are always there when it comes to online casinos and any type of online gambling. However, you're never visible. Players don't really know you exist. You're always watching and always analyzing everything. Owen, hi, nice to have you.
Thanks for inviting me, and a warm welcome to your listeners and viewers.
Would you share with us what's the mysterious position that you're taking?
Sure. So I've been involved into the gambling industry for around 10 years to date. Before that, I was involved in software development. So it's a bit of an interesting journey into compliance. I describe myself as a governance, risk and compliance professional. However, my work has taken on focus of more the anti-money laundering compliance when it comes to gambling. And that's been the focus of my work for at least these past five years or so.
So right now your position, I think that's the longest name of the position I ever had. So the full name of your position now is Deputy Money Laundering Reporting Officer.
Correct.
Is that
That's
true?
Correct.
So what exactly does it mean? What exactly do you do on a daily basis?
So on a daily basis, I deputize for the Money Laundering Reporting Officer. And our work involves essentially responsibility of the AML compliance program within the organization we work with. Some of our day-to-day tasks involve reviewing player accounts, checking the way that they are funding their gambling account is via legitimate means. We can prove where the money is coming from. That is perhaps the most important question I ask myself. Gambling being a very regulated industry now, just like banks, insurance, financial institutions, we have obligations when it comes to AML compliance. And that also involves a lot of reporting, risk assessments, whether it's the business or player risk assessments from an AML perspective, that is. We also take a lot of time to work on processes and training, right? Because it does require a fair amount of skill to, one, understand the risks involved, especially when you have a non-face-to-face relationship with your players. It's not like a physical casino, you know. You can't really see who the player is. He will or she will send you their ID documents, right? He will screen that as well with sanction screening tools. So you ensure you don't have any international sanctioned players coming into your casino, right? Or even if there is adverse media, they would have been involved in a crime, right? You don't want any of those proceeds of crime to be mixed with legitimate funds and used to fund the gambling account, because you'd be participating in the money laundering. So training and mentoring of staff does take a good part, and we take pride into teaching and mentoring staff, because they will be probably the money laundering reporting officers of tomorrow. And it's a lot of reporting, both to regulators, but also to management, working with other stakeholders, like evaluating payment products as well, and identifying if there are any risk, working with gameplay, looking at the product portfolio. Some products are more riskier than others for money laundering. So at the lower end of risk, you have slots, casino slots, right? Because you're playing against the house. In the case of online, you're just playing against an algorithm. But then on the other end of the spectrum, the highest risk would be poker games, right? Because it could be what is known as chip dumping or collusion between players, cheating. And also quite a hot topic at the moment is sports betting integrity. right? Match fixing. That is also a big concern for AML, because it is fraud essentially when matches are fixed, or um, the proceeds of that are attempted to be laundered into a casino.
But from my perspective, whenever I talk to casino operators or basically to whoever from the industry, they typically say in one sentence, "Hey, we need to take care of the AML slash KYC, and those are those boring lawyers who are gonna take care of that." So how does the reality look like? I mean, does it really happen that you catch that, hey, that player is is there's something wrong with it, let's investigate? Or is it just looking at the screen all day long and saying, okay, 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 done, done, thank you? What's the reality?
So the reality is, you have to think about the processes and the policies that are aligned with heavy regulated industry now. Okay, so there are regulations in the country you operate in, but there are also regulations by the license you are playing under. So, to give you an example, let's say a Finnish player would be playing with a website that is licensed by the Malta Gaming Authority. Now, in that case, the gaming regulations of Malta would apply and would govern how the AML is done. Now, at the end of the day, Finland and Malta are both EU member states. So their regulation is all based on EU regulations and directives. So they're trying to follow the same thing. But there is a bit of a difference in the implementation, which the upcoming EU AML regulation, AML package, let's call it, it's going to try and address and harmonize the approach when it comes to regulation. So back to the question, we do assess the player from the Malta regulation in that case, and we look at the risk assessment from 4 areas primarily, which is the customer, right? So details about the customer, with the source of funds, we call them, or source of wealth, right? There is also a difference between that. Is coming from legitimate means. The player is employed, or they have inherited a sum of money, or they have worked for the past 20 years, managed to save something, and they decided to use those proceeds to gamble, right? We consider the age of the individual. We consider their geographic location, whether they are in where they live as well. It also gives you an idea of the player's wealth. And we do see some discrepancies sometimes. So you'd see high deposits, and then you'd see a neighborhood which is, quite average and traditional, and you ask yourself, how come did this player manage to deposit so much? We look at their payment methods. So it's quite safe that you see payments using debit cards to fund their accounts, but there exist as well voucher methods. And some of these providers, they accept cash in order for these to exchange these vouchers. Now, cash is risky because, from an AML perspective, that is, there's nothing wrong with cash per se. It is legal tender, right? You can go in a shop and pay with notes and coins. That's perfectly legal, okay? But when we don't know the provenance of those funds, and the player used a cash option to conceal it, or an attempt to conceal it, it does raise a few questions. Let's not call them suspicions at this moment. As I mentioned earlier, we consider the gameplay as well, what kind of product they're involved in. And then all of this contribute to our analysis to determine, hey, this is legitimate, and we derive a risk rating for that player. Depending on the risk rating, we can continue allow him to enjoy his facilities, right? Or if there is further information required, we go either use open searches, or we have databases that we look up on to verify the information that the player has sent us. There are other tools available that you can check if an ID is valid, or even databases that can tell you if the social security number is valid. We use a lot of these information sources, and a good AML analyst will have the skill set necessary to conduct searches without giving in or asking the player too much information if the information is readily available. Because then you have to be careful as well not to tip off the player that he is under investigation. Tipping off is a criminal offense punishable by jail time, right? So I would consider, doing the AML review in some ways as walking through a minefield. You have to be careful where to step. But I can tell you it's very rewarding as a job. And it gives me satisfaction to know that if you're submitting a report to what is known as the Financial Intelligence Unit of that country, and that report makes it to the police investigation, you can really help to investigate much bigger crimes. I was reading the work done by Gimlet, which is a UK consortium made up of financial institutions and banks. That is, they derive intelligence from there. And they managed through such reports to crack down on cases of human trafficking and modern slavery. To me, the fact that I submitted that report and I helped investigate and bring to justice these criminals, I might have saved lives inadvertently. So that gives me great satisfaction in the job I do.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. But I'm an engineer underneath, and whenever I see the system, I try to look for the weak spots of the system. So, could you answer the question? Like, let me complicate the situation a little bit. Let's say I was born in Poland. I'm Polish. I have Polish passport. I live in States in Texas, but I want to play in a casino operating under, let's say, Curacao license. And I've heard there's a thing. I'm going to ask you a question about that later, but there's a thing called offshore licensing, so that you're actually playing, playing in a casino in a different country using the license provided by some third party country. And say I would be using money, well, not from the proven source. So what exactly would you do? What would happen?
All right. You mentioned Curacao. Curacao is currently going through a bit of a process and an update in their regulations. It's no secret that in the industry, Curacao was seen as an easy way to get into the market because the regulatory obligations were not as onerous as the European counterparts. Okay, so the AML officer there, KYC officer, not really be as busy as his European counterpart in that regard. But your question, I can derive similarities to what are known as grey markets. So in a grey market, there is either no local regulation governing online. So you can't really, as an operator, get a license there. Or only some products are licensable. That is one example I see with Ireland, for example. You have Sportsbook, which is regulated, and you can apply for an online betting license for Sportsbook. But casino isn't. And so generally, in that case, I see operators that would have an MGA license, and they would have their Irish players playing on the Malta license for casino and playing on the Irish license for sports. So in terms of the checks, they vary per jurisdiction. If we had to look at the European jurisdictions, they mostly follow the same rules when it comes to AML. Okay, so you have the compulsory risk assessment, the €2,000 deposit threshold, okay, or else if there is a withdrawal, right? Important aspects to check are the ID, that the ID is verified, that the payment methods are verified. In some countries, you can have an external verification service. For example, in Sweden, they have a system called Bank ID, where the banks have made a consortium, and player would have already been verified by the banks. So as an ID. So they give you, the player gives you this ID when they sign up, and you know that there has already been a check that you can rely on. In the Netherlands, it's the same thing. They have a system called IDIN, right? In Denmark, they also use another system called BitID, which is a system that Danish individuals can authenticate and verify themselves even when they use government services, right? Now, under the MGA, if you have all of these gray markets, you don't always have these tools available. So normally the way of verifying the ID would be to request a government issued ID or a passport to verify the identity of that individual. But these are all small intricacies that go around when you are onboarding players that are not native in that country. But then when you have these regulated jurisdictions like Spain, Sweden, Denmark, you normally would offer your services under the Swedish license to Swedish players only, or Swedish, or people living in Sweden. So we covered ID verification, payment methods, and again, you have to check sanction screening, adverse media. Actually, sanction screening, the obligation is to screen them at registration. And now with what's happening in the world, this is an even more important aspect to check for sanctions. And also, especially when you have sanctioned individuals that are sanctioned because they would have been part of a terrorist organization, right? So, in fact, our programs, we don't call them AML, we call them AML CFT, countering the financing of terrorism as well. Okay, and that's a heinous crime, if you ask me, which we are bound to prevent. But the intent is different than money laundering there.
So we got quite international here. Let's imagine the situation where you are just a starting casino operator. Would you recommend starting in just one regulation, one license, say MGA on Malta? Or would you recommend going for multiple licenses? I mean, as many as you can. What's your recommendation on that?
Well, yeah, that's depending on who your investors are and what your budget is. On a serious note, the most important question to establish is who are your players going to be? From which jurisdiction are they coming from? Right? Do you want to target a specific jurisdiction? You know, if you want to do UK only, for example, you apply for a UK GC license. Licenses like Isle of Man, like Gibraltar and Malta, just to name 3 examples, are seen as jurisdictions, and even Curacao for that matter, jurisdictions where you can service other jurisdictions that traditionally do not have their own online licensing regime. The way I see it is the first question is who are your players going to be? Then an important part of the cost will be once you've established the jurisdiction, you probably need some presence there. You need to set up an office, you need to have local employees. If we look at the MGA requirements, the Malta Gaming Authority requirements, you need to fulfill some key roles, right? And you can't just do everything remotely. There would be need some expertise locally in the regulations to be able to fulfill that role up to the MGA expectations. The MGA, in fact, in their guidance do talk about fit and proper, right? You don't just say, here's my friend, he's going to be my MLRO, and yeah. No, you're going to go over a process where the MLRO candidate will be interviewed by the MGA as well. And once the approval is given, you also need to keep up with the ever-changing regulations and also build knowledge. And there will also be requests from the authorities for information which need to be promptly addressed. So a jurisdiction like Malta, where we're seeing the online gambling regulations coming back from 2004, and I had the good fortune of seeing it evolve as well throughout the years. Now, 20 years in the making, there is a certain element of maturity. So, you know that in IT we talk about the capability maturity model, and it's the same thing with regulations and how the local market has evolved. It is a very much different situation from 2004 to now, and Malta has then made its own improvements, and we had the Gaming Act in 2018, which replaced the previous regulations that gave a more prescriptive approach to functions required, to technical standards of the gaming system, to functions, to even taxation and the contributions have been updated. And proper guidance as well, how to go about your online business. But also you could see a large changes in regulations in the EU, because Malta joined the EU in 2004. So regulation evolved as well from an EU perspective. We had the GDPR, if you remember, there was quite a big thing, and people were getting scared. If you don't comply, you're going to get 10 million fine, etc. But nowadays, it's mostly the tech industry that sees the brunt of it, or the big players, rather than the gambling industry. Same thing with regulation on AML. Casinos became subject persons to the AML regulation in 2018 with the 40 AML directive. And I could see the first time when we were trying to fill in the questionnaire, the annual questionnaire for the Malta FIU, when we're trying to bring in all the data elements together in order to provide the reports. And I think plenty of operators struggled with it at the time, but as we go along, now it's the sixth iteration that we're going to do. It's going to be, it got a little easier. One thing I forgot to mention earlier about our job, we also don't just rely on perception when it comes to analysis or assessment. We use data a lot. And in fact, we're quite good friends with the business intelligence team because we have a lot of interactions. We ask for a lot of data. And our systems have to be designed in a way where we can pull out data as well, right? Not just help us with the automation or with the flow or with the workflow, that is, when we are evaluating players, but will also be able to give us the data which we need to be able to make accurate assessments, but also to fulfill the regulatory obligations.
I want to stick to what you said about operators struggling to keep up with the changes in the licensing requirements. And what I get a lot from the market is also that constant fear that, for instance, if I'm going to offer my solution as a white label type of casino or lottery system, whatever, then I might lose the license, and that's the thing you definitely don't want to happen. But have you really witnessed anybody losing the license?
There were cases, for example, where the MGA revoked the licenses of operators or even platform providers. But to my knowledge, these were, grievous offenses, or maybe it was kind of planned as well that they would withdraw from the market. I think with platform providers, it also depends what they're going to offer. If they're offering games only, so we talk about platform, we talk just about games, there are technical standards that are required, and you just need to assign individuals and to keep up with all of the regulatory obligations, right? And ensure, for example, test certificates are up to date. That if you are due to report any figures quarterly or biannually to the regulator, you file them in time, that the contributions due are paid, right? And that your onboarding process for the operators is also kept up to date. I think for operators, in terms of regulatory obligations, they are much more onerous. For a platform just offering games, you typically would have barely any ML obligations because you're not actually you don't actually have a direct relationship with the players themselves. Primarily, your clients are the operators. Now, in the case where you're offering sports feeds, for example, or a sports platform, then your obligations are a bit more onerous because then you have to factor in sports betting integrity, right? Um, but I think the general mantra is if you're abiding by the rules, your license you should not. There should be no reason to be revoked.
But what I've seen with GDPR, I mean the reality of
Yes.
GDPR, not just the rule or the law. What I've seen is that even if you offended the law in some way, consciously or unconsciously, then if you can prove that you were acting in a good faith and you really tried to obey the law, but just you slipped your leg, just something happened. Typically, the regulator wouldn't fine you as badly as they could. So, what's the reality of running the business when it comes to licenses?
All right. So this is from a data protection perspective. The GDPR was a welcome regulation in that sense because there was a lot of abuse when it comes to handling of personal data. But it also is a little bit vague in some areas, to put it bluntly. So it talks about adequate technical controls. The word adequate is very subjective. What might be adequate for me might not be the same for another person. You mentioned a good point. If you can prove that you've documented your judgment at the time or your rationale, let's call it, with the regulator, and obviously it makes sense. And it's always a good idea to get an expert opinion when you are unsure yourself. Then there should be no reason why to get a fine. And that fine, the fines issued by GDPR, if you look at the regulation, they talk about proportionality as well. So they won't fine the 10 million. That is an uppermost threshold. There you have to see the turnover of the company and the type of infringement or infringements committed that would then be factored in to the calculation of the fine. Now, with defining the actual fine, it would be issued by the data protection office of that country. Okay, so if you have an MGA licensed operator, it would be the IDPC in Malta that would actually issue the fine. But to my knowledge, the highest value of the fine has been 5,000 euros so far. To put things into perspective, that is.
Not that
Yeah,
much.
exactly. It's also a risk because, on the other hand, you get operators say, but why should I spend so much money on compliance when, worst case scenario, I pay 5,000 euros? And in this industry, 5,000 euros is not a lot of money. Let's put it bluntly as well.
All right. And speaking about money and speaking about costs, I think you are the right person to ask. If I were to expand my operations of my casino or sport betting, could you give us the estimate of opening the entity into new jurisdiction? Like, are we talking about hundreds of euros? I doubt, but are we talking about hundreds of euros, thousands of euros, dozens, hundreds of thousands, millions?
If I was starting out a casino operator business just on MGA, I would set aside at least, the very least, €1 million. And let me tell you why. The minimum paid share capital at the moment, just to establish the Maltese entity, because you need to register Maltese company, is €40,000. Then you factor in your technical solution because you need to build a website, you need to host it on servers, so you need a leasing agreement, you need an office where you'd have people working, and at the very minimum, if you're a casino operator, you need an MLRO, you need at least one director, you need a CEO, you need someone to take care of marketing, you need someone to take care of fraud, someone to take of the payment integrations and payment products. Okay, but obviously you can perhaps bundle some of that under an operations umbrella to start off with, right? All these integrations with casino providers also cost money, so there'll probably be some upfront costs related to licensing costs. You need probably to hire some consultants as well to help you to get through. So when you're done with your application, apart from the costs of all of the company documentation, some of which would need to be notarized, so again, more legal costs. Obtaining, for example, as well, the criminal conviction sheet of an individual, especially when you have key people like MLRO or directors, they would need to seek approval. So the MGA will conduct background screening on the individual. They will look at his or hers 5 years experience prior to the application and how they're suited for that role, right? Considering all of that, integrations, legal costs, technical costs, the fees owed to the MGA, I would say you definitely need just €1 million to start off with. Now, the MGA is also considering raising the paid up share capital of the company before you apply. And you could see increases up to $500,000 there. And the reason being is to kind of enforce that companies of a certain repute will be allowed in that jurisdiction. Unfortunately, with all the opportunity that our gambling regulations have offered in the past, it did attract some bad actors. Recently, there was also a report that some members of the Ndrangheta mafia organization had connections to an online casino. And there have been other instances as well in the past. So the fact that it was so easy before, it meant more opportunity for the bad actors to exploit it. And this is the reason why the MGA is considering raising the fees. But then, obviously, from a startup perspective, it's going to be a little harder unless you're very well funded. And as we said earlier, this is just MGA. If you want to target other regulated jurisdictions, there are the costs of those jurisdictions that you need to factor in as well.
So, yeah, speaking about other jurisdictions, there definitely are some shared costs that if you did it on Malta, you could use it anywhere else, like just from the top of my head, like some kind of marketing activities. You already have your brand, so you don't have to create it again. So is it, from your perspective, easier and cheaper to set up the second and third jurisdiction once you have one, say on Malta, or it's bad thinking?
Having an MGA license to start off with is a good platform because you can have certain functions already ready up and running. But is it easier? I think it depends on which jurisdictions you're going for. If you start, for example, with MGA and want to go to UKGC, there is quite a steep ladder to go through when it comes to applying for a UKGC license. We're not saying that other jurisdictions are very much easier nowadays to get into. All right. Plus, in some jurisdictions, you will still have the requirement to have local presence. For example, Spain will require you to have a director who is based on the mainland in Spain. So even though you'd have um, your operations running in Malta or Gibraltar, which is just there connected to Spain, you need to have the individual on Spanish mainland, right? And you find the same requirement in almost every jurisdiction. So I don't think you can run the whole show, to answer your question, from one location. You will need a main office and perhaps some satellite offices to complement that, depending on the requirements of the jurisdiction. But things like marketing, customer support, you can find perhaps more accessible or affordable jurisdictions. And typically, you see, for example, customer service operations for gambling set up in either Eastern Europe, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania. Um, Skills are much more accessible there. Um, and also cost-wise, it's a bit more efficient.
I think I know the answer before I actually asked the question, since you were born in Malta. But would you say obtaining the MGA license and treating Malta as a headquarter for any other actions and obtaining any other licenses, is Malta a good place for it? Or should the casino operator think of some other location?
I definitely recommend Malta because of
Of course.
the not only the good weather, but um, it's, as we said earlier, there is maturity there. 20 years in the making of regulations. You find experienced individuals that can help you set up, right? So getting help is also readily available. Very, very professional help that is not just taking money off you and that's it. You don't know where you stand. And you're well connected to Europe. You're trading in euro. And also there is a certain repute as well to the MGA license. So if you're applying for another license and you're mentioning that we already have an MGA license, that does help you in the application. Definitely having a reputable license already does assist with the license making process. So yeah, definitely recommend Malta. The taxes are favorable at this moment. We hope that the MGA will continue giving us favorable conditions because the increase in cost of licenses is also a bit concerning for startups. Having said that, I think as well the industry is sort of, it needs a bit to reinvent itself because we've seen a lot of casino slot games, being the same thing, the same providers. You open up a new casino, you offer games from 3, 4 B2B, the largest B2B providers, and that's it. You set up and you're done. But I think there needs to be a bit more innovation. One of the innovation I'm looking to see more is perhaps using virtual reality, using as well crypto for wagering, right? So we saw that in Curacao happening already, but it's not regulated there. Now the European Union has created a framework which is called the Market in Crypto Assets Regulation, just came into effect in June, where crypto can be used as normal money, right? It's setting the framework for that. From an AML perspective, if used correctly, it can solve a lot of these KYC issues because you can put your KYC technically in your crypto wallet. And then you can wager with that crypto in any casino of your choice. And if that casino wants to access your information, they can go fetch it with your consent, obviously, from that wallet instead of you having to supply it every time. So I think that would
That's
be great to see. It would also cut PSP costs for us. It can provide instant payments and withdrawals as well, and much more efficient at that. So yeah, I'd like to see more innovations like these into the industry and make it a bit more immersive.
That's so surprising because the very last thing that I would expect to hear from a person in AML and KYC business is, "Hey, introduce more crypto." But yeah, when you explain it, it sounds like
Yeah,
it could be way better, way more transparent, right?
but that's the problem again with crypto. The original idea was very good, but unfortunately, crypto was misused. And unfortunately, it's also a tool that is very much misused by criminals nowadays, especially for terrorism financing. Sorry. Yeah, if you look at how Binance got that huge fine recently,
Yeah.
it's unbelievable. And even how the current conflict in Palestine, how Hamas got their funding as well. Probably there is crypto involved. I don't want this discussion to turn into conflict, but we cannot be not mindful of what's going on around the world because it also has an effect on the risks we are exposed to, right? This is why we're mentioning them. I don't want to offend any of your viewers or listeners on this podcast.
Of course, of course, of course. But whenever we are talking about the future, and whenever we are talking about new technologies, and as you said, innovation, I cannot just not use the opportunity to ask you about AI and machine
Yes.
learning. I mean, in every single industry, everybody is like saying the word AI at least 5 times in one sentence. So, what's your take on that? How could that change that business?
Yeah, I think a lot of people as well tend to misuse the word AI and just, use it casually. One needs to make a distinction. I always tell my peers as well between automation, machine learning, orchestration, AI. The proper AI that can make decisions, um, I think it should be used as a way of assisting humans rather than actually doing the final decision, right? I mean, if you look at ChatGPT, it's a wonderful thing. I think that's one of the most significant technological improvements that happened in the past 5 years, at least, in my opinion. Okay, but we know we have a problem with autonomous vehicles at the moment. We can't get it right as the human race so far. Same thing with compliance. Um, I think there is a lot of scope of using AI in anti-money laundering. You tend to need to analyze a lot of data and documents when you are carrying out player reviews. And also, you need to do a lot of research. So what if you had a tool that can do all this research for you, collate it, also decipher between what is purely speculation or actual factual information, right, to present to you, can determine all of that in a few minutes and give you a recommendation whether you're going to approve, reject, report, display. So there is a lot of scope in AI in collating all of this information and then analyzing it in a much more efficient manner. I think that would be a dream for many operators who want to provide a seamless experience to their players. And we know this is quite a differentiating factor uh, as to keep up the level of service in a regulated operator. So you have to balance keeping up with regulations, player experience, commercial pressures. it's not easy for regulated operators today. And I think AI in AML, but also in other verticals in the business, can be a differentiator.
But still, you are on a position where you say that should be more of a advisory role
Yes,
rather than taking the responsibility for it, right?
that's correct. I feel it should be more on an advisory role at this point in time. Um, Call me skeptical, but I'm a person based on facts. The track record has not been that great of AI systems. But as a previous technological person, I also understand that there's a cycle through which technology goes. So AI will get better. It will get, it probably is much better, but due to some risks involved, some of the technology is not publicly available. But probably it could take at least another 10 years until we can say, I trust AI blindly.
That's a extremely rare opportunity for me to talk to a person who has a technical background and truly understands, the downsides of all of the new technology. Because don't get me wrong, I stand on the very same position as you are. I mean, AI, that's a great thing. Machine learning, it's really picking up, but I think there's a huge hype on the market right now, and
Yes,
everybody's blindly following it. And people are using those terms not really knowing and
exactly.
understanding what it really means.
Exactly.
And
So yeah, my
yeah,
advice to our listeners and viewers is, explore what someone will offer you as a solution that will mention AI, but use your judgment, because it's very easy to say, my solution uses AI, with question about the components that are used, and who has developed it, what kind of research did they do, what are their data sources, because AI will only be as good as you train it as well. If you give it incorrect information, and we know there's plenty of it on the internet, it can give you incorrect recommendations as well.
yeah. And at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself question: who's going to be to blame? If anything goes wrong, who's going to be jailed? Like, is it going to be some kind of chat GPT, or is it going to be you, right?
Exactly,
And
accountability and responsibility is a key question there to ask. Um, but the EU is also working on regulation for AI, and and I think this is important. Perhaps equally important is not to over-regulate and make it complicated so as not to stifle innovation. We did mention in this podcast that I think this industry does need a bit of innovation to come through at this point in time, but probably there are and much more other industries outside of gaming that need this type of innovation. And I see this as a risk with EU, that you have a lot of regulations, right? But in keeping up with these regulations, it's expensive. You need to find the correct people that know how to navigate around these regulations. Um, and then you just then spend too much time on regulations, while your focus should be more developing the product and giving that experience to your customers, rather than immersing yourself in the regulation and worrying how you're going to meet it.
so, is it your take that when you observe the markets as in a macro perspective, and how different countries are regulating themselves, what's your take on the direction it's all going to? Is it going to be overly regulated? Is it going to be like just red tape everywhere, or is it going in a direction where it actually makes sense?
This is a concern I have. As we go along, we're seeing a lot of regulations come through. I see also focus on responsible gambling, or safer gambling, as I like to use the term better. The intent is good, right? But I think when you are regulating, you need to know not just what the law state, but in practice how it is achievable. Let's give an example. I always like to give examples. Um, if the bank is doing AML screening on you and asking questions, you're perhaps more motivated to supply that information to a bank because you need a bank, you need electronic means of carrying out transactions nowadays. Otherwise, you're completely disconnected from society in some aspects. But when it comes to the same question by an online casino, you perhaps think twice before divulging information about your bank accounts or what you do in life, your occupation, etc. And this is the same thing with regulators. So the intent is good, yes, to stop money laundering, but somehow we have to get a perspective from the operator and not just from the regulator. That in practice is a little bit difficult to achieve. Now, when it comes to safer gambling, there are regulations, gambling regulations that put obligations on an operator to ensure that vulnerable persons are not exploited for gambling, and that you prevent underage players from actually using your services. It's a legal requirement, right? But because it involves knowledge of human psychology, the regulator won't really tell you how to put it in effect. It's different with AML. We mentioned earlier, we consider those four aspects when it comes to performing an AML analysis. But with safer gambling, it's not that easy. And it's really a psychology subject to be able to determine gambling addiction. So we're not expected as operators to be psychologists or assist with or diagnose these issues. So when it is prescriptive, the approach, you know what to do. But when you just have rules, but they don't tell you, they don't guide you actually how to do it, it's a little bit more difficult. So it's going a bit in the second direction as I see it in Europe. And then you have enforcement on operators saying they're fined this because of social responsibility failings, right? Now in UK, with their reforms in their gambling law, there are obligations for affordability checks as well. And the UKGC has been under, this caused a bit of debate amongst operators and the industry as to how invasive these checks are. You have to strike a balance between regulation and ultimately what is entertainment, no? Because what we're seeing as well is that players don't like all of this and they move to the black market, and that offers no protection to players. So gambling has been around for beginning of time, and it's not going to go away. So the way I see it is there needs to be a balance between regulating and putting it into practice. And unfortunately, a lot of regulators they need to abide by the regulations, but when forming their policies or their guidance, they need to take a more practical approach, in my opinion.
I could not agree more. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Owen Baldacchino, the person who knows where you take your money from. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.